Welcome to Step by Step, the series where we take a look at very specific steps in the decisions application. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the run flows for list step. The run flows for list step is a great step that allows us to do a lot of batch processing so that we can run things and take a list of items and run them through kind of like how a for each step might work, where it takes a list of items and runs each item through one by one through a process that we get to build in order to expand and create whatever it is that we want to then build or develop from there. So we're going to take a closer look at this step, look at the ins and outs of it, and try to get a good idea of what can happen in it so that you may decide for you if this step is useful and may have a lot of useful items in it. So the first thing we're going to look at in the run flows for lists is that we have the ability to set up an input and an output type. So the input type is required. This is what allows us to say what is going to go into my run flows for lists step. With this, we can simply pick any data type in decision, so we can go with some of the primitive types, decimals, strings, whatever. You also have the ability to choose any of your own user-defined types if you have any user-defined types created as well. So if you have your own data structure, for example, like I'll use here, you can pass information from that data structure into this process so that you can use it to then process through that whole entire list of items one by one. Once you add that input, you'll notice the input appears here. So expecting that list to then go through into your step, and we can then pass it from wherever it comes from, as well as an option to remove null results. So if you want to remove anything that doesn't exist or has any null value there, you can remove that as well. Otherwise, we can continue moving on with our process. We also have the ability to set an output type. So this would be if you want your process to output data, which we can have it do. It depends on how you want to use this. You may not even need it. But if you want it to output data, you can also set what that output will be as well. So maybe, for example, I want to send in just my specific user-defined type, but maybe I want to have the opportunity to output a string, a list of strings. Then I can do that here. And so it'll output a list of strings based on each of these items. So each process that runs through will output a string, and then the final will output a list of all of those strings by the end of my process. So the next thing that we'll look at, we're going to come back to this to talk about the different run behaviors on the flows. But the next thing that's important is that the runs flows for list actually has a flow built within the step. And this is where we create the process that is actually going to run it for each item in my process. So when I take in a list, it'll go through the flow that I can create here. When I click edit, I can start to create my flow and then do something with it. Let's just throw a send email step here as an example. So let's say I want to set this up and I want to start taking my list items and I want to push it through my steps that I'm going to build here. So if I take this and I go to select from flow to pick some items, you'll notice that I have input, flow data, which we always have, and then we have input. This input is whatever I chose to send into my step in this process. And so this input is that user defined type that I had created, this database structure that I had chosen to be my input, and then here's all the items within it. So if I want to grab the email address from this database entry, then I can do that to have in my send email step, for example. You'll also notice if I have configured my run flows for list step to have an output, my end step will have that output data here. So then after I'm done building out my process, I can make sure that whatever I want to send out at the end is going into my end step, just like I hope, so that it can output the proper data. Right? So that that's overall the general concept of what's going to happen here. Whatever you build in here is going to run through each item in the list one by one with that input here. So then this process can now process all of those items at once and continuously send these things through. Uh, I do have the ability to use this run flows for list step almost just like a for each step, where I can just have it go through one item one at a time, and then that flow is just like what comes after the next path on my for each step. But I don't have to do it this way. There are more configurations that I can set, and that's where the run behavior comes from. So run behavior, there's a few different options to choose from here. Synchronous is the most basic. Synchronous is just essentially it's real time. It's going to happen in the flow as the flow's there, just like regular, step by step, one item at a time throughout my list, similar to what a for each step would be doing. So I can run it synchronously. I have the ability to set it up to run like a thread job. Thread job will run synchronously, but it will use multiple threads to execute the process faster. So I can still, instead of having it run on one thread, one item at a time, I can spread it across a few threads so then the process will go a little bit faster. I don't have to wait one by one, but it's still going to, still take a little bit of time and will, wait for that process to go through and complete all of the items. The next option we have is work queue. Work queue will allow us to have this run across multiple queues instead of just one queue. The next option is thread job async. Thread job async will take my process and it will run completely asynchronously, meaning that this entire parent flow will not wait for this run flows for list process to finish. It will start, it will hit this step, and then it'll push that and it'll run it in the back end, and then the rest of this flow will then just continue. So that's what thread job async will do. Async and wait is kind of similar. It will push it all to run asynchronously, so the process will run asynchronously. However, it will still wait for all of the processes to complete before it continues the main flow. So thread job async will just immediately finish the rest of the parent flow here to complete the process, and that'll all run in the background. Async and wait, it'll all run in the background, but it'll wait for all of those processes to get completed before it continues the parent flow. And then our final option, system threads. This will run through threads outside of the thread job queue, and it'll split the work evenly across those different threads. So you can choose whichever one fits your situation the most. The most common likely being asynchronous and maybe thread job async or async and wait. So there's a few different ways that you can run these and use these processes. Now, a couple things that are very important to note, things that can lead into a couple common issues that users may experience when they're not as familiar with Runflows for List, as well as things that are important to just note in general, is first of all related to the outputs. Regardless of if I set up the output type, the output data will be different depending on which of these flow behaviors I choose. So if I, for example, create just a quick test output here, and I want to pass data to my end step. If my run flows for list is running something like synchronous regular behavior, you'll notice if I go to send data to a later step in my process, I will have result list, the output for that I set up on my run flows for list step. And for most of the options, I have the ability to take that. Even async and wait. Async and wait allows me to output data, so I will see my result list. However, in the case of thread job async, it, it will send everything to run completely independently of this parent. And because it is running completely independently of this main parent flow, I will not have any outputs to be utilized. So a lot of people may not necessarily realize, and they may use thread job async thinking that it's just one of the other types or that it's similar to async and wait. But in thread job async, there are no outputs because it is not expecting it, and this flow doesn't know when this process will be done because it pushes it to complete it completely independently of this main flow. So since it doesn't know when this process will be done, there is no way to receive outputs from it. So if you have a process that can run without having actual data output, whatever that process is doing, then the thread job async is an option. Otherwise, the other options, the other run behaviors that we have available will have outputs. So then you can have those outputs available to use in any later step in your process through the results list. Another thing that's important to note is what happens with debugging this information. And so there's two ways that you have to consider things when you're trying to debug if you're trying to see if your process is working. So let me set up just some quick data to throw in here. So let's say we've got a couple things going through my process. All right, we're sending some data through into my run flows for list step. I'm running this synchronously. If I debug and I run the process, you'll see I've got my main flow, and then I will have my run flows for list step. And I can actually see the flow that is in my run flows for list step that I set up. Because it is synchronous, I can view that data and view it just from the regular debugger if I'm running my debug from here, right? So anytime it's something like synchronous, I can actually see that data. However, if I have this run asynchronously, whether it's async and wait or thread job async even, it does not matter what happens in this. If I try to debug this, you'll see I will only see my main flow. I will not be able to look further into my run flows for list step. That is because of the nature of asynchronous behavior. It is running on a separate process in the background on different threads, and it is not running on the same exact thing that this debugger is looking for. So because of that, I will not see that data. So if you're trying to run a process asynchronously, whether through thread job async or async and wait, you will not be able to look at that data through the regular debugger. So your options in this case are to either temporarily change it and run it synchronously so that you can just test and make sure that your data is going through properly. You can see your flow and make sure that your data is doing as you hope it to do inside the run flows for list step. Or your other option is to go down here and open the global debugger. And with your global debugger, you have the ability to turn it on and it'll actually track anything that gets run. So you can see I have it async and wait, which wouldn't normally show my data if I run it. I don't get to see the flow within my run flows for list step. But in my global debugger, I do have the ability to look at it. So I can see the process and I can see what ran when it hit that step. So if you need to check that, and running it in synchronous mode doesn't work for you because of the way that your data looks, then using the global debugger will work. Just keep in mind the limitations, and you don't want this to cause any performance hits, especially in a production environment. So turn it on just to get your data real quick and turn it back off. We do not want to keep the global debugger running. One final thing that I'd like to discuss are just some general use cases. Why might you use this step? Where might it be useful? And one great example is in one of our training projects within Decisions. We use the run flows for list step, and we specifically use the async and wait behavior because we pass in a list of addresses. And then within the run flows for list step, we use the USPS normalize address step to normalize those addresses and then mark data as if there's an error in normalization, if my current database needs to be updated with the new normalization stuff, if what I have in the database is already exists and is fully updated, or if I don't even have an entry in the database. And my run flows for list will do all of that marking, setting the states of error or update and everything like that. And it'll output a list of all of those newly updated values so that I have everything fully up to date, and then it'll output through. And we use async and wait because we can run through all of those things. It'll process all that data asynchronously and it'll go very quickly for us, but then still be able to output data. Another case that may be useful, especially with you want to consider the thread job async option, which will make something run completely asynchronously and not have any outputs, is something like sending a batch set of emails. Where you can send a bunch of emails to a group of people, you have the ability to utilize the input from the list that you sent into the run flows for list step to maybe get your emails or get data that's going to be placed in the bodies of the emails, things like that. But then you can send a batch group of emails without having to run through the for each step. You can have it run asynchronously, so your process, the rest of your process, doesn't have to wait for that and everything like that. So then you can send it completely separately of the rest of your process. One final example is if you want to write entries into a database. For example, if I want to use this create user example here, which is a database structure, if I want to write entries into a database, I can also do this asynchronously. Since I'm just writing entries, I don't need this to output anything. I don't need data to come out of my run flows for list step, but I can write a large amount of database entries to create them. If I have something that needs to create a ton of entries, I could run through that run flows for lists. I can have my list go in, pick the specific items from the input here that would match, and so on. And now I can create all of these instantly and asynchronously separate from my whole entire main process. So anything that's writing, changing, updating anything to the database without needing an output can totally be run with the asynchronous option here, so that my run flows for list will allow it to work properly. So that's the run flows for list step. There's a lot of great ways it can be used, and hopefully this gives you at least a little bit more insight onto how the run flows for list step can be used in a process that you may decide to run it for. Thank you for watching.